Hello, folks. Welcome. This is Race Matters, and I'm the host, Eddie Carson. And one of the things we do here at Race Matters is we explore the nomenclature as we delve into the temporal aspects when it comes to things such as race, culture, society, and all the elements that really drive the normative aspects in terms of how we define our humanity and what's taking place. And as I always look to do, and I appreciate folks who are always chiming in here, bring in fantastic guests. And so, as we delve in here, I welcome you to WJOPLP Joppa Radio, coming out of Newburyport, Massachusetts, here at 96.3. You can find the show on YouTube and SoundCloud if you're not listening live on public radio. So, we're going to talk all things HBCU today. And for those of you who don't know what the acronym HBCU means, and there may be some of you who are out there, and I don't want to be presumptuous, that is historically Black college and universities. And so my guest here is an expert on this, knows a lot more than I do. And Chauna Lawson is just fantastic. And you know what? The cool thing about Chauna, I'll say this, is that not only is she the founder, director, the CEO for HBCU Con, and you heard me correctly, right? I mean, we're talking about really thinking about the experience, particularly when it comes to, you know, historically Black college university, particularly Black folks leaning into the realm, right? Of thinking about all things similar, if I could say this, to Comic Con, right? How people come together, how they engage, and we'll delve into that a little bit more. She's also the former associate director of the HBCU program of Human Rights Campaign. And so, Shauna, welcome to the fold, my friend. Thank you for joining us here at Race Matters.
Thank you so much, Dean Eddie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's just really happy to connect with you, even if it's on Zoom.
Absolutely. Hey, this is wonderful. Be wonderful if we're in studio doing that kind of good kind of funk that happens when you
Yes.
kind of get into the circular nature of jazz and blues and all that stuff. But you know what? Here's the first question that I want to ask you. And before we delve into some of the particular aspects here, I
Hmm.
want us to get to know you first, a
Okay.
little bit and everything, if that's all right.
That's
So
fine with me.
so hey, tell us just a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to high school, college, study? Tell us just a little bit about you.
Sure. So again, Chauna Lawson, she, her pronouns. I am what you would call a native Washingtonian. I grew up primarily in the Washington, D.C. area. I spent a good chunk of my early childhood in the city, in what we call DC proper, because DC is so geographically small, even though its metro area is massive and incorporates a lot of people. So I spent most of my upbringing in the city in an area that is called Petworth. It's about 5 minutes driving from Howard University. So I grew up from a very early age. I was very much entrenched in the HBCU atmosphere. My parents attended HBCUs. My dad went to Bowie State. My mom went to University of District of Columbia. And my honorary mother, or my stepmother, also attended Grambling State University and Virginia State University. Even my sister went to Bowie. Like, it's a whole family affair. But I spent most of my childhood there at a time when DC was very much known as Chocolate City. It was about 80% Black at the time. And that really kind of shaped a lot of how I viewed the world, just being in community with fellow Black folk in mass, and knowing and getting to like be acquainted with all the diversity within the diaspora, right? Because there's a huge West Indian population here, Caribbean population. We actually had a parade. They called it Georgia Avenue Day, that would go from what was formerly known as Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and they would parade all the way down to Howard University. And that in of itself was a whole experience. And then consequently, because DC's infrastructure started to change and the public schools were kind of getting a little shaky in terms of like the infrastructure. I wound up, I spent a couple of years of my childhood going to school in Prince George's County, just because my stepmom at the time was a guidance counselor at the school, so she like pulled a few strings for me to go to the school there. And then I wound up going to high school in Montgomery County, which is one of the most affluent counties in the country, and graduated from Montgomery Blair High School. So by the time I was 18, even though I spent pretty much all of my life living in the DC area or close proximity to DC, I had a very like diverse and kind of interesting like experience when it came to like public schools, because I went from DC, where we didn't have a lot of resources in terms of like materials and things like that, to going to this very robust prominent magnet school that had like all the resources at your fingertips. So from a very early age, I kind of got to see how your tax bracket or your zip code greatly impacted your experience in education. So I hope that covers my early childhood piece as well.
Oh no, that was good. Absolutely. So
Thank you.
tell us a little bit about your college experience and really your journey into HBCUs.
Sure. And it's so funny. I was just telling a colleague about this yesterday. My HBCU, my decision to go to a HBCU was almost like a happy accident, in the sense that I applied. I was that girl who applied to like 1,001. It was really like 9 schools, but out of all the schools I applied to, I only applied to one HBCU, and that
Okay.
was Bowie State. And it was pretty much like, first it was kind of like, I don't even want to say my safety choice, because my father had went there, my aunt went there, my sister hadn't gone there yet because I'm the oldest of the 4 of us. But really, what ultimately kind of made me really consider Bowie was when I visited there for a open house, and it was something about that experience that just felt like home. Like it just felt like I was really going from like my parents' house to a favorite cousin's house, and that I was going to be nurtured in a way that I wasn't really didn't know I could be nurtured in higher education, but also at the same time getting a world-class education, right? By comparison, I was applying to schools I applied to University of Maryland, I applied to University of Central Florida. Miami was like my number one choice. I wanted to be in Miami Hurricanes so bad,
A
until
little
I saw.
hot down there.
Yes, but I was fine with it. My grandfather, God rest his soul, he lived in Palm Beach, so I was quite acquiesced to the weather, and of course, it's very humid here, so like the humidity wasn't nearly as much of a shift. But once I saw the price tag and how much it was going to cost me to go there, I was like, well, maybe I'm not so sure. And ultimately, what the thing that really, the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, was I was offered a full academic scholarship to Bowie State. And even then I was kind of like deliberating. My dad specifically, he was like, you're going to Bowie because that's where the money is. But I had talked to some of my teachers and from like middle school, and I gotta actually shout out some of my high school teachers too, because we had a W.E.B. Du Bois Honor Society, and I was part of that club. And really, a lot of the Black teachers in my high school were very adamant in pushing for us to consider HBCUs as like our choice. But when I spoke to my history teacher from middle school, she was kind of the one like, go where the money is. Like a degree is a degree, and if they have
Breathe,
the program, yeah, she's like,
breathe.
go where the money is. Yep. So that was what I decided. And it's so funny because that one decision that I made changed the entire trajectory of my life and how I view the world. And it was like from day one, I found like my crew of fellow nerds, and I don't know what gave me, I'm sure that if you look at a picture of me from my freshman year of college, I'm a dead giveaway as a nerd. But something about me, they were just like, she's one of us, right? And as I was moving in, there were these two guys. They were like, yeah, like you should. They helped me move in because it was like campus move-in day, and they were some of the upperclassmen in the SGA and student government who were helping me move in. And they were like, hey, you should come to our suite and like hang out with us, blah blah blah. So much against my better judgment. So if you're like new to college, don't just go to somebody's suite randomly if you don't know them. But much against probably would have been my parents' better judgment, I went to this suite, and the minute they opened the door, I just knew I was where I needed to be. Like the whole wall was full of monitors. Like some people are watching anime over here. There's people playing Guitar Hero over here. And next to them, there's a group of people playing Dance Dance Revolution for
I
those who
remember that.
are Dance Dance
I
Revolution
remember
days.
that.
And then like in the middle, there would be like another group of people having a conversation about like the socio-political environment. It was just everything that I could have possibly hoped for in a home away from home. And that coupled with the overarching HBCU experience, like the band. And I was in another interview talking about like the HBCU band experience, and part of the joy of like living on campus was the build up to homecoming, and you could like hear the band practicing in the distance. So that was just like a really cool thing. And then of course like Greek life is which
Yes.
is not necessarily exclusive to the HBCU experience, but they're heavily tied together. And being Greek on an HBCU campus is kind of like being a celebrity, or the equivalent of being an athlete, right? So they were very deep and very entrenched, especially like even the faculty. A lot of the faculty were Greek. So it was just really an awesome experience. And I kind of just took it all in. I wound up pledging. I pledged Delta Sigma Theta my junior year in spring 2008. And even prior to that, just by some happenstance, I wound up joining a Christian organization on a mission trip to do Hurricane Katrina relief. And that was another big experience that kind of like shaped how I viewed the world and how I viewed like race versus economics, because so much of how that panned out was heavily steeped in those two things. And I became inspired to like begin what ultimately became Bowie State University's first alternatives, like actual institutional alternative spring break program. So those 4 years, even though like on the grand scheme of things, it was such a short period of my life, really to this day shape how I view the world. It inspired me to pursue a career in public service, and really nurtured who I was as a nerd, who I was as a up and coming Black woman, and all those different things. So shout out to my alma mater, Bowie State, and of course Howard, just being in proximity and having that graduate experience there, like further solidified it. Howard is its own like brand, right? It's its own level of prestige. And I feel like every HBCU has like a fingerprint where no two are alike. But of course, there's nothing like your undergraduate experience. And that really carried me through. Even the relationships I built, like to this day, have carried me through in my career, like in my social life, and all of those different things. So yeah, absolutely would highly recommend, not going, not like, what is it, knocking it if you didn't attend a HBCU. But if that's something that you're considering, whether it's for grad school or undergrad, I highly, highly recommend it for sure.
I'm glad you mentioned that. And before the show, one of the things we were talking about is the
Mm-hmm.
fact that, I looked at a few HBCUs,
Mm-hmm.
did not end up going to one, and
Right.
it is interesting, particularly in terms of where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
Fact that you grew up here, but I also went to a predominantly white independent school, and yet in those
Mm,
institutions, even in a place like Montgomery, Alabama, they were
right.
they were not parading HBCUs, though we've had folks from my
Mm-hmm.
state go to HBCU and everything too.
Mm-hmm.
We think about historically Black colleges and universities. One of the things I think about is I think about all women's colleges. I think about
Mm,
these spaces where folks can go and feel like their authentic self. They can feel like
hmm.
this is a place in terms of where they can grow, they can lead. And there's something to be said about being in spaces where most of the folks are like you, which we know
Absolutely.
that's not always the case, giving you the room to navigate and
Hmm.
everything too. What
Absolutely.
role what role did that play for you in thinking about attending an HBCU?
I think it played a huge role because, as I had mentioned earlier, I started out in my early childhood going to DC public schools where it was like very much, all pretty much all black, at that point in time. And I wound up transitioning from that to Prince George's County. While it's the most affluent, predominantly black county in the country, it was at that time a little bit more, I guess, mixed, if you will, or diverse. So that was when I started to like meet people and go to class with people who were of different races and ethnicities, right? And then I wound up going to middle school and high school in Silver Spring, Maryland, which essentially is like a melting pot. I met people from countries I didn't even know existed, right? I remember like it was really like a pardon my ignorance moment because when I got to seventh grade, at the middle school I attended, Eastern Middle School, one of my dear friends to this day, her name is Ha, and Ha is Vietnamese, right? And all I knew about Vietnam was that it was the name of a war. I'm like, you mean like you're from Vietnam, like the Vietnam War, like it's an actual place, So like that in of itself, it was a culture shock. It was very much a culture shock for me. I had friends from like Azerbaijan, and even like in terms of just the diversity of the black community. There's a huge African like popular. There's a lot of Ghanaians here. There's a lot of Nigerians in that area, and I think it's kind of more so spread out too, and especially when you think about like the city in Prince George's County as well. But that was really like a remarkable experience for me. And it was also the first time that I really started to experience racial discrimination, where people were kind of like challenging my intellect, challenging whether or not I belonged in certain classes. And also, even like I had dated outside of my race, started to date outside my race for the first time. And I encountered people whose like parents did not approve of me because of my race, right? Even in the case, like I dated a guy who was like half, his father was black and his mother was Thai. And that was when I first started to realize that like it was like the all skin folk aren't kinfolk type
That's right.
thing.
Yes.
He had a lot of, and his father had a lot of internalized anti-blackness, and you could see how it kind of like influenced his mother's perception of race and everything, and in turn ultimately impacted him as he started to like grow up and develop. And then I dated a guy whose family was from Italy. Same, kind of like very much the same thing. His mother believed in the Hamitic myth, and I didn't even know what the Hamitic myth
Oh,
was.
are you serious? I
Yeah.
do, and that's unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, so I learned about the Hamitic myth
Wow.
because his mother believed in that. So it was very much like a stark contrast to what I experienced, particularly in DC, where like the name that I got teased for, one of the things that I got teased for, like, was I was called white girl because I was the closest thing to white, and like in hindsight, I unpack that as like, a response to colorism,
Yeah.
within the black community. So it's very interesting how like even though I've lived in this area my whole life, like, we talked about this earlier, how depending on your zip code or depending on which side of the river you're on or whatever the case may be, you have a very like different kind of experience. And to your point when you were talking about how like growing up in Montgomery, like you weren't really kind of pushed or encouraged for the HBCU experience. Like even with me, like in Montgomery, and when I was in Montgomery County, it wasn't until I became more in community with the black teachers that I was like being pushed to kind of like, or encouraged, I would say, to go to HBCUs, where I have friends who went to school in Prince George's County, and they were like, it was like a thing because most of the teachers were Black, and they all, and a good chunk of them went to HBCUs, and or were members of a Black fraternity or sorority. Mm-hmm.
So when we think about your experience and we think about HBCUs, one of the things that's out there sometimes that people don't realize is that
Mm-hmm.
there's this assumption that white people don't attend HBCUs, which
Mm-hmm.
that's completely not true.
Right.
What was that experience like, landing on an HBC, historically Black, college and university campus,
Mm-hmm.
and then again, right, being in the majority in a
Mm-hmm.
space where you engage with white folks who are not in a
Mm-hmm.
majority, and what were those conversations like?
Very they were very like thought provoking and enlightening. I had a few like friends of multiple races, like not even just white, but like non-Black, Latino or Hispanic. I had a few Asian friends, and particularly with Howard University, they have a strong Jewish community because of, like a lot of the predominantly white or traditionally white institutions, I would say, had quotas. So if
Right,
you were
right. No Black folks, no Jewish folks apply.
hmm
Absolutely.
Yep, yep. If you were not a white Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, what do they call WASPs or whatever? Like you essentially were up against these quotas. So HBCUs were kind of like a safe haven for anyone who didn't fall within those confines. And I think the conversations for them, it was like very interesting because I think for most of them, it was like the first time in their life where they were the minority,
Yeah.
right? I think I have one friend, my best friend Erin. She wound up going to University of Maryland, but she grew up in PG County, so she was kind of used to it, and it didn't really like phase her, if you will. But a lot of these folks were kind of like challenged essentially in their whiteness just by nature of like the classes and everything being centered around Black culture, right? And that was something that if you're a white woman from La Plata, which is a town in southern Maryland, it's a fairly rural town. At least it was back then. It's a little bit more developed now. But like it was a culture shock for them. And we actually had one. It was one classmate I had named Stephanie, who was originally from Pennsylvania, and she didn't know that Bowie was a HBCU until she started her first
And
day. First day.
wait. So she
Yeah.
attended Bowie, didn't know it was
Uh-huh.
to her first day. So how did that unfold for her?
So I think that she was just kind of like shocked, like she just didn't know, I guess, because of however it was marketed to her, or I don't know if she didn't go to the website or what, but for whatever reason, oh, she was also part of the honors program with me, so we were all like on scholarships. So I think that was part of what appealed to her, was that she was getting this scholarship to go to to go to this college, and she just went kind of where the money went. And she spent her first couple of years with us, but I think she ultimately wound up transferring, I want to say, to Penn State.
Oh, big,
But don't,
drastic change
big difference.
there.
Yeah, big,
I
huge
definitely,
difference, right?
and I don't think, no offense to Penn State, but Penn State's just not my cup of tea. So,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's very, like it's one of those big like athletic program type deals. And Bowie is like fairly small, at least it was at that time. It's rapidly growing, but by comparison to like Howard or Hampton or Prairie View, we were fairly small. So I think that was kind of like a culture shock for her, particularly coming from Pennsylvania. Like it
yeah,
wasn't like she was from Philly. I think she was from like a very
right.
small town. She may have been from like York or something like that. So she wound up transferring, but we still like keep in contact. She's still very much in touch and in like kinship with myself and all of my core group of friends. So I think that's very interesting how that manages to unfold, where my friend from the Plata wound up she also transferred as well, but she wound up coming back. She transferred to Liberty University, which, yeah, right. And then she realized like she was the minority at Bowie, but then when she went to Liberty, having come fresh out of Bowie, she came back with like horror stories about the racism, there that she witnessed as a white person, right?
Oh,
Um,
and evangelical Christian aspects
yes,
of liberty and
yes,
everything too,
yes.
I can imagine. Absolutely.
Right, right, right. It's like they make, University of Maryland look like a HBCU in that sense. So she wound up coming back and finished her degree at Bowie. So I think that it's very interesting how it's almost like opening Pandora's box, right? Where like once you have that experience and once you become aware of all of these different things that you may not have been cognizant of because it's not your experience,
Right.
it's hard to unsee that, right? And it's hard to not to have your antennas up when you bear witness to it in real time.
It's interesting you mentioned that. And folks, if you're just chiming in, this is Race Matters. I'm the host, Eddie Carson, and I am here with Chauna Lawson, and we're talking all things HBCU. And, I have no idea how old you are. I'm pretty sure you're much younger than I am, but I'm going to go ahead and start. Actually, no, I know for a fact you are. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with this though. When we think
Mm-hmm.
about HBCUs,
Mm-hmm.
for me, one, growing up just around the corner from Alabama State University, the big thing for us was the Turkey Day Classic, is the football game between Tuskegee University and Alabama State University. And they don't do that
Nice.
anymore, which is disappointing, mainly because conferences and all that other stuff, they just broke up the
Mm-hmm.
funk that was there. But the other
Mm-hmm.
thing that really shaped my experience, and I would say shaped the experience of not of white folks, but it's definitely black folks too. One,
Mm-hmm.
School Days. Did you ever watch School
Mm-hmm.
Days growing up?
For
And,
sure.
if that had an impact on you, but the other show that had a huge impact on me, um, and this also allowed white people entry into
Mm-hmm.
HBCUs who didn't know about them, was A Different World.
I knew that
You
was
knew I was
coming.
going
Yes.
there, right?
Yes, yes, yes. And it's so funny because I never saw either of those, or at least not in a way where I could like fully digest it and understand it until I went to Bowie. It's almost like a rite of passage where if you go to a HBCU, if you haven't seen those movies before you attended a HBCU, they're gonna make sure that you've seen them by the time you finish, right? And looking back on those, it was like, yeah, like I could imagine being in that generation and like come, because I'm an 80s baby, 90s kid, right? So when it was at the height of its popularity, particularly A Different World, I was like probably a small child, so I
Yes.
wasn't really able to fully grasp the subject matter and all of that. But yeah, I think that they were very much like influential, and I think that both shows did a very good job, or rather School Days is a movie, but I think that both productions did a very good job of like introducing folks to those experiences and doing it in a way that was done with integrity, but it
Mhm.
was also like well balanced, right? So you had your haha funny moments, which is like very much the HBCU experience. You have the social aspects and the things that like make it lighthearted and fun, but you also have like the academic and socio-political aspects of it where it's like, okay, guys, this is like a serious issue here, or as the AKAs would say, a serious matter. And I think that that was really well done. And definitely shout out to like Spike Lee for his interpretations in School Days, because I think that that was like a really cool way. And I think Tashina Arnold and Tisha Campbell,
Yes.
they bodied their roles, and I just love how like their friendship has kind of like matured and grown from School Days to Martin to like all the different things that they do, and even the cast of A Different World, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, the show turned 20 or 25. They had a milestone recently.
Oh, I
It
didn't
may
know
have been
that. Okay.
so they've been actually going on tour, touring the HBCUs. The cast was
Yeah.
did a tour, I want to say last year or the year before, and then it kind of revived the relevancy of those shows, because prior to I would say definitely prior to 2016, there was this overarching question of, are HBCUs still relevant?
You,
Um,
that's
mm-hmm,
interesting, and that brings us up to the next point too. There was one of the things that's happened, particularly with HBCUs, is
mm-hmm,
this interesting challenge. So one, you have the challenge of you have um, you have state-funded institutions that
mm-hmm.
have been historically discriminated by
Yes,
state legislatures in terms of receiving funding. Many of them have had
yes,
to file lawsuit against
mm-hmm,
state legislatures. You have some of your really prominent um, private institutions who have large endowments, such as
mm-hmm.
Hampton or a Howard, but
Yes,
you have places like Howard that have been called out by students over recent years for one, right? They recently, I'm excited, hired Nikki Hannah Jones
mm-hmm,
there, but they also just brought in, starting, I want to say maybe next academic year, Ibram
mm-hmm,
X. Kendi, who's leaving
mm-hmm,
Boston University. So they're spending
mm-hmm.
money here, but students are like, wait, but we're paying all this money, and yet, we're not seeing it with some facilities or this stuff here. I'd love you just to share a little bit about this debate when it comes to funding and money and all those things that I'm sure you know more about than I do.
Absolutely. And there's like so much nuance to that, because you have like Howard, which is a very prestigious private institution, but Howard receives a substantial amount of federal funding.
That's right.
So and they're like one of the few HBCUs that receives the amount of federal funding that they do, because of their ties with like the Freedmen's Bureau, them being named after General Oliver Howard, who was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. Versus like public, Bowie is a public institution, right? So we get state funding, and I'm glad you brought up the lawsuit piece, because Howard University Law Center was actually the ones who filed a class action lawsuit against the Maryland Higher Education Commission for disproportionately funding their HBCUs in the state of Maryland. So even though it was like terrible, the circumstances, but I think it showed a lot of solidarity that you had this private institution like taking an interest in making sure that other institutions on the public side were getting more of the funding that they deserved. And to that point, like I think that people kind of have this misconception that because you're in a historically Black institution, that we're above the fray of capitalism, elitism, colorism, homophobia, transphobia, and all these other isms that like kind of plague our society. When the fact of the matter is that no community, is above that fray, and it shows up a lot, like you said, in how folks get paid, like even the faculty, like how the faculty get paid versus like the top of the line administration gets paid, or the president gets paid, the amount of financial aid that goes around, for the students. And even with Howard, that was like kind of something that I struggled with in my graduate endeavors, was the lack of financial aid, particularly in the master's program, where I feel like in the doctoral program, you're more likely to get that funding. So I thought that was very interesting. And even to this, and there's been protests, for all of these things, whether it was the disproportionate funding, whether it was lack of safe space for LGBTQ students and faculty, whether it was sexism and misogynoir. And I think Lucy Diggs Slow was like an incredible case study in not just misogyny, but also homophobia at that institution. And she was a founder of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and she faced a lot of ridicule and ultimately a hostile work environment at the hands of the president at that time, who she served under. I can't remember the president's name, but it was so egregious that by the time she started to get more of the accolades and the compensation and all that she deserved, she got sick. She succumbed to illness as a result of all the stress that she endured at Howard, and she died. She had a very like untimely transition. So, no, like we're none of us are above that fray. I think it kind of goes a little, it might be a little bit better checked at the public institutions because they usually have to answer to the state or the higher authority with more transparency than the private institutions do. But even then, it's like any corporation, even though it's technically not for profit, there's this huge gap in terms of like how much the president gets paid versus how much the faculty get paid versus how much the staff, the other staff get paid, and then consequently how much funding the students get, right? And then the prices of tuition, like the amount of tuition that my parents had to pay, was and even the amount of like grant money and funding that they received is like night and day compared to what I had to like go up against. And for the next generation it's even worse. And then you have the athletics thing is part of it too,
Right.
which is very prevalent in any college, and that's what a lot of people don't realize. They think that Ivy League schools got all this money and all these resources because they have like the best and brightest folks there, or all these elite, and that's partially true. But the fact of the matter is that like a lot of these Ivy League schools got a good chunk of their funding in the beginning because of their athletic programs, and of course being in part built by by enslaved people
I
as
was gonna
well.
say, right, right. And we know, particularly, some things that are connected to schools like Harvard,
Mm-hmm.
Brown University.
Mm-hmm.
I even want to say what Calhoun, um,
Uh-huh.
Yale, I believe.
Yes.
So, I'm going to stop there before I get myself in trouble and I
Yeah.
tread into categories that are not there. One of
Right.
the things that you do that is just absolutely just intriguing, and I mean intriguing, is the
Yeah.
fact that you are the director, the founder, the CEO of HBCU Con, and I have it right here. It's HBCU Con is a community celebrating, bridging the gap between historically black colleges and universities,
Mm-hmm.
and black geeks at large,
Yes.
right, through
Yes.
this unique lens. Y'all bring, you got hashtag, black, geek homecoming experience, all of that stuff. And for folks, you got to know, because one of the things that I told Shauna before, we got started, is that I always want to be a nerd. I always wanted to fit in, and then the nerds, the geeks, were the really cool, sophisticated ones. I don't know if they quite accept me. I need something. She said, I don't know. I got a little Douglas, maybe rolling in me or something like that. And and Chana is a you are a geek, you are a nerd. Tell
Mm-hmm.
us about HBCU Con. What is that? Because it is just fascinating.
Well, I think that, I very much created the purpose and the reasons why I conceptualized it is very much twofold. On one end, it was to for folks like me who attended a HBCU, I wanted to have a community and experience where folks could kind of like remember or be nostalgic, or even like if you're a current student, you could just really hone in on who you are as a student, but do it through a geek lens, right? Because geek culture and nerd culture historically has never been seen as tied to black culture, where as I you probably can tell by my story, I grew up in a world where they were never mutually exclusive. They were always intertwined. My mom is a Trekkie. She named me after Star Trek, after Shauna Treskelion from the original Star Trek series. My father is a huge Star Wars fan, primarily because James Earl Jones was like that dude when he was coming
Right.
up. So like he loved Darth Vader, and all those different things. My mom, she watched X when I was growing up. She would watch X Files. She subsequently would watch Stargate. So like they were always kind of like very much entrenched in those two things. But as I navigated non-Black spaces in particular, I kind of saw how nerd culture and geek culture were kind of more likened to like almost like white culture, like Big Bang Theory, basically, where you have
Which, by
these
the
like
way, I've yet to see Big Bang Theory, but I hear it's hilarious.
it is.
I will eventually get around to watching it sometime.
Yeah, it is. But I think it's very much a testament of like that disconnect between the two cultures, because the pretty much the entire cast is white with the exception of one Indian student, right? So like that's the stereotype, is that nerd culture is primarily
Right.
dominated by white and Asian folk, when in reality there is a sect of Black folks who love and indulge in anime and science fiction, fantasy, video games, you know what I mean, tabletop games, and of course comics, right? But the difference is that we never had, until recently, we never had too many spaces where we could indulge in those without either having our what is it, like gatekeeping for our nerdiness, like especially if you're a woman and a Black woman on top of that, like people will kind of like give you quizzes to see if you're really about that life or not, which in of itself is like problematic. But not only just that, but not having a space where we could do it in community together, like as Black folk. And that comes the second like underlying purpose of HBCU Con, or the HBCU convention, which is for folks like yourselves who didn't go to a HBCU to have an authentic HBCU experience through a geek lens that you can call your own. So like I didn't, you didn't attend a HBCU, but you can call the HBCU convention your own. And because such a huge prong, or a huge I think value of HBCUs as a whole is just being in community with not just Black Americans, but Pan-Africanism, and being in
Mhm.
community with Black people from around the world. We've never like gate kept in terms of like whether or not you attended a HBCU. I think it's all about like your mindset, and like not trying to, not embodying that level of internalized anti-Blackness, which by the way shows up in HBCU, among HBCU alum as well. So that essentially is kind of why I created that. And on top of that, because of all those overarching things in the community, I just wanted a space where unapologetic, Black folk like ourselves could feel safe, or at least as safe as we could possibly be, because I know that like
Right,
there's really
right.
no such thing as a safe space, but really have a space where folks could feel brave enough to be their true authentic self, whatever that, in a really unapologetic way, where you don't have to compartmentalize your education experience, you don't have to compartmentalize your heritage or your love of nerd culture.
Would you say that this is a space that has also been really quite inclusive and inviting and welcoming to queer Black folks to participate?
Oh, absolutely.
Can
Yes,
you say a little bit
absolutely.
about that?
Yes, please. And I consider myself bisexual as well. And I didn't come out until I worked for the Human Rights Campaign.
Mm.
Because that was when once I was on gay payroll, it was like, okay, it's safe to come out now, and I can, who's going to check me because they're signing my checks. So, and I really kind of took it upon myself, especially having worked there and seeing how much, because the vast majority of HBCUs are in what folks consider the Bible Belt, right?
Absolutely.
So a lot of that culture impacts impacts the HBCU community, and historically, the LGBTQ population has found themselves along the margins, even though, just like the church, right? Like how the choir director, that whole narrative of like, oh, the choir director is gay, but it's like don't ask, don't tell type of thing. The same thing is true for HBCUs. Like fashion is a huge asset, an aspect of HBCU culture. And if you ever go to a HBCU fashion show, you can see it, like it's literally like going to a mini Renaissance, Beyonce's Renaissance tour, mixed with, like, I don't know if how familiar you are with ballroom, but like
Oh, I'm very familiar.
yeah, ballroom culture is heavily influenced in the fashion clubs act very much like houses, you know what I mean? So I felt like it was so important. And I think the nerd community is very one thing that I think the nerd community does do well, because so much of the lore and the fandoms are kind of rooted in queerness and rooted in oppression. Like even when you look at Star Wars or Star Trek and all these other different things, that it's very much, it's not, it's still a lift, but it's not as much of a heavy lift as it would be in, say, like the Black church or any other church for that matter. So especially like in today's times, I feel like it's extremely important for me to and for the team to be cognizant of creating those spaces. And even, you know, our team, like we're a mix. Some of us went to HBCU, some of us didn't. Like my vice president AJ, he went to Fayetteville State. And his wife, who's also part of our team, Jackie, our partnerships director, they went to Fayetteville State together. That's how they met. But we also have folks like my my homie Lorenzo, who is very much like proud queer, man and Black man, and he does podcasts. He does a lot of his content based on queer culture. So I think that it's like very much like that's part of the unapologeticness, right? Is like you don't have to compartmentalize any part of who you are, and that homophobia, all these various isms at the end of the day are overlays of white supremacy. And if we're going to really unpack that and kind of decolonize ourselves from that, then we have to make sure that we are inclusive and accepting of all of our people and not just a select handful,
I
Thank
love it.
you.
Oh, preach, my friend. I'm sitting here all excited, listening to you and everything too. Well, Shauna, we are here at the end of this episode of Race Matters, and this is fun. We're going to have another conversation because I
Yeah,
got.
this is the fastest 40 minutes ever in my life, I
Oh,
swear.
we're gonna have to come back to this because I got more. So I do foresee part two, if you
Yes,
accept, coming up,
of
and we're going to
course.
do that. You know, one of the things that I always like to do is I always like to give my guest a last word. And
Okay,
so I'll let you think about whatever that last word may be. If you can maybe,
sure.
take maybe a minute or so to kind of share what that is. And folks, I'm going to step back. You're listening to Race Matters here at WJLPLP Joppa Radio 96.3. I'm Eddie Carson. I'm here with Chauna Lawson, and I am going to give her the last word. My friend, you have the microphone.
I know that's right. Well, first and foremost, I just want to invite you, if you're willing to come down to the DC area, I would love to have you as a guest and a speaker at any and all of our events. So I'll definitely keep you posted on that. And I think I want to close out with a quote that I got from a book called Black and Queer Campus by Michael Jeffries. And in the foreword of that book, is a piece where former Vice President Kamala Harris is reflecting on her days at Howard, right? And there was a moment where one of her professors told her that you are running a race that has started long before you and will continue when you are no longer here. And the charge to you is, what will you do with the baton while you have the time to carry it?
Folks, thank you for chiming in on Race Matters. Next time, take care.